Hello, my name is Catherine Galloway. I live in the Abbey ward of Cambridge. Some people call me Catherine, some people call me Book Lady because I run a little library outside my house. Two people call me Mummy, and a lot of other people call me that curly lady who has crazy ideas. So I think that's all of who I am. Increasingly, I think we should think of democracy as a verb rather than a noun. It has to be a doing thing. It has to be a muscle that we exercise daily because I don't remember in my lifetime a time that it has been more under threat, more chipped away at, more sliding away from us. So democracy feels a very powerful thing, but currently it also feels terribly fragile. And I really worry about that. And it's easy to be overwhelmed, I think, by the absolute state of the world right now and think, but what can I do? But a phrase that I love is, but what can I do? Said 8 million people. And the answer is, well, let's take it back to the 8 million. Let's take it back to all of us and say, well, what can I do just in my little corner? And I think that's what democracy has come to mean to me is something daily and active and increasingly personal. There are a few things that you would think of as being active in the democracy space that I don't do. So, for example, when I was working as a journalist abroad, somebody tried to sign me up to a union, and it was in France, and they're red hot on unions. And they said, oh, you'd be a great little unionist, which, apart from being incredibly patronizing, also put you right off. And I thought, no, that's not what I want to do with my democracy focus. And something that I started 5 years ago, which was my little free library outside my house, my community book box, has turned out to be probably the most democratic thing I've ever done. But I didn't expect it to be that at the beginning. And that's what's kind of lovely because democracy has a way of surprising you and creeping into spaces that you create. And so all I did in January 2020, just before the pandemic, on my birthday, was put a wooden box with doors on a stick outside my house, and I filled it with books. And I said, free books for the community, free for the neighborhood. And it didn't fly straight away. Some people were like, oh, wow, that's quite cool. But, it didn't really work. And somebody said, is that a speed camera? And somebody else asked me if I'd got planning permission. And it was bright yellow. And I sort of flyered the whole neighborhood to tell everybody what it was and pleased to contribute. And it had a little bit of traction, but it didn't go mad. And then March 2020, suddenly we were in lockdown. Something really scary was happening. Our idea of community and how we look after our neighbours completely changed. And suddenly that little book box became a focal point. It became like the village pump. People were gathering around it and talking and exchanging things. So it very quickly evolved from swapping books to there was that absolute craze for jigsaw puzzles during that first lockdown. And, people were swapping jigsaw puzzles and people were visiting 2 or 3 times a day because there was literally nothing else to do. And people were leaving encouraging little notes for each other or little gifts or painted rocks or all sorts of things. And it really started to become somewhere quite important. And because we were all quarantining and so on, some of the elderly people in my neighborhood couldn't even get up to the book box and couldn't come and do it. So we started running like door-to-door services and leaving the books that they'd requested on the doorstep. And other people were leaving things for me on the doorstep, loads of donations, but also randomly, here's a cabbage that I've grown in my garden and I thought you might like it. And suddenly it became again, this very active thing. And everybody was in some way contributing to it, whether they were leaving books, taking books, talking about books, asking their neighbor if they'd like something. And it became, yeah, this little bright yellow focal point in a time of real high stress. And from there, 5 years on, it's been absolutely loved to death. We're already on our second iteration of the box. We've done some design adjustments. We've made it better. We've made it bigger. Um, but it's also created a bit of a ripple effect in the community because democracy is about permission, right? So, no, I didn't have planning permission to put this library up. I did not. I just did it and I thought, let's see what happens. But me doing that gave other people in the community permission to do things that perhaps they'd been wondering about. So my neighbor, Tony, who's a really amazing gardener, she took on the little patch of sort of verge, which is right opposite the library. And she said, Catherine, do you think anyone would mind if I sort of turned that into a community garden? And I was like, go for your life, Tony. So now she does that, and two neighbors help her. Um, and so it kind of allowed people to step into a space where they were more active about giving to others. And democracy is about giving to others. It's about giving us all the power and the permission to to be better, to be different, to pull together. And I also started doing a pop-up book box at the local food hub during lockdown because Abbey People, the community organisation, started a food hub, and I was getting way more books than I could handle in into my little library. And so I said, could I bring my very best books, my very nicest books, up to the food hub so that children who'd been sent home from school very rapidly with absolutely nothing to keep them from being bored. They might not have had, any technology at home. They might have, their frazzled parents were trying to keep their reading going, but obviously everything else was closed. So we started doing that in about the April of 2020, and that has now grown to 4 community libraries across Abbey. And again, the same sort of magic is happening. Partners like Jesus College, which is absolutely incredible, was like, we love these libraries. How can we help? We're right on the patch that you're building them. Could our maintenance team build you some libraries? And we said, yes, please, we would love that. And so 3 libraries have been built by Jesus College and donated to the Abbey People Little Free Library movement. And one was installed just a couple of weeks ago. And again, it's like the community garden idea. This was installed outside our volunteer steward Angie's house, and there was a little patch of grass with a tree in front of her house that all the houses sort of looked onto in her area. And within about a day, some little kids, it was during the summer holidays, some little ones came and brought a picnic blanket and sat and had a little reading corner in front of that grass. And they would come every day and they would choose different books from the library and sit down and all chat and read together. So they made their own little community. And within about 3 days, somebody, and Angie doesn't know who, put up a swing in that tree because that person had maybe been wondering about putting up a swing for the children and thought, oh no, it'll get vandalized or it won't get used or I'll get into trouble because I've put up something without permission. But because the library was there, again, it opened this door to somebody else doing a nice thing. So now, within a week, the children of that little area have got a library, a swing, a safe little garden place, a place to meet and chat that isn't in their houses. They're off their phones and they're engaging with the world. And the loveliest thing, within 2 weeks of that, they'd made their own little poster and said, we're having a community get together. They said, these little children, you're having a community get together. Please come along, bring drinks and snacks. It's Sunday, 2 till 5. And the best thing about it is meeting new friends. And so that blew me away because I thought, my gosh, give people the tiniest slither of permission, however old they are, and these kids are like 6, 7, 8, and they run with it. My goodness. So that's what I do for democracy and community building without actually thinking that that's what I was doing in a way. It started as a literacy project and has become a project of giving in all sorts of other ways. I think what inspired me to open the Little Free Library was, January 2020, things were looking a little bit bleak. Um, we were in austerity. January is always a terrible month. I'm a January birthday. It's always grim. People have sort of extended themselves over Christmas. They're feeling the pinch. Your taxes are due. It's just general gloom and grayness. And I thought children are being, children are walking past my house on their way to Tesco's. I live quite near big Tesco's, and they're walking past my house and they're being told by the whole of society, don't look, don't touch, don't skip. Nothing good ever comes for free. Nobody, be careful of strangers. And all of those things are true. But with two children of my own at that point, my kids were like 5 and 7. I wanted them to have another narrative. I wanted them to have a narrative of like, if you do good things, maybe good things will come. And there needs to be a bit more joy. And I thought at the time, January 2020, how can things get possibly worse? Because we were all struggling and feeling so miserable. And I just thought, well, let's try this. And so that did inspire me to do a small thing to try and turn that narrative around, to sort of change the story on what kind of community we were living in. Of course, little did I know that, 3 months later, things would get immeasurably worse. But I suppose I just wanted to make a small change in the narrative. That's what I wanted to do. The fault lines in our democracy right now is that nobody is telling the story of democracy well enough. Nobody is making the case for it, that it is something fragile, that we cannot take for granted, that is not going to always be here. Nobody is making the case that we all have to work for it. It's a right and a responsibility. And instead, democracy, the discussion about democracy, and that's why I love this project that you're doing, is being superseded by a wider, noisier, more fractious conversation about politics. And people are camping on their positions, and you're either right or left, or you're a hater, or you get cancelled, or anybody that dares to put their head up and say something now, is slapped down by somebody else. We've forgotten how to discuss, and we've forgotten how to treasure things that we've always had, but which in many, many countries in the world are not even won for the first time yet. And I think the more we move towards the extremes and the intolerances, the more fault lines will appear in our democracy. So we've got to find common ground. We really have to. Otherwise, we're going to lose something very precious and more quickly than we think. So we've got to tell better stories about what democracy can do, what it should be, what it could be at its best, and what the alternatives are. If anyone's forgotten what those are, what's the alternative to democracy? Have a really hard think about it and decide if you'd like to live in that world. And then, yeah, I think another fault line is just it looks like a wicked problem. Democracy is under threat. That is so huge that people sort of, apart from voting, if they remember, they don't know what else to do about it. They think, oh, I'm not going to run for the council. I'm not going to be a politician. Therefore, I can't do anything about democracy. And that's absolutely not the case. But we're not offering people enough entry-level ways to exercise those democracy muscles. And so a fault line is almost it is that it has become too big and too intractable to try and fix. And it shouldn't be. We just need to chip away at whatever margin we're at, and each one of us 8 million or whatever it is, do one thing. What I would like to see in the future is that democracy is treasured, it's it's protected. It's something we want to export. It becomes something that we give to others in our daily choices. And I would like to see democracy as a listening place, because that's what we've forgotten how to do. Yes, I might not agree with all of your views. Some of your views might be absolutely hateful. And you don't have the right to say absolutely anything, but we should give each other the right to be heard. And we should, in a functioning democracy, I think that would be a much less scary and intimidating thing to do. So dialing down some of the emotion that we're at right now, and try and relate to each other as human beings first and political beings second. I think I would love to see that. And I would love to see, again, these entry-level points to democracy being scattered everywhere through daily life. We should, allow our little ones to be democratic and have choices. We should allow our elderly people to have more of a voice and not to feel so invisible. We should allow it. We should enable it. We should make sure that everyone who wants to do even the tiniest thing is supported and enabled. And then I think we get to a democracy community that works. Interestingly, my son, my youngest, has started a new school in the last couple of weeks, and the first club he's joined is debate club, which is hilarious because I think he's been training for that his entire life. And he's just come home tonight from debate club, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What was the motion?" And he said, "The motion was, should children be allowed to sanction teachers?" And I knew immediately what he was going to say. And he's like, "Of course, I thought we should." But the fact that he's being taught to argue and think and make his case at school, and that he's come out buzzing from it, what a privilege. I couldn't be more proud of him, and I couldn't be more delighted that that's an opportunity that he's got now at 11 years old. But I find it a little worrying that possibly he hadn't had that opportunity until now. So how early do you start with democracy, and how do you start, I'd love to see it being much more creative in how we introduce people to democracy. And I would love it to be a very compelling narrative. Democracy occasionally means being disappointed and having your heart broken, right? So many times, more than I would like, my library, my little community library outside the house, has been completely cleared out, and people have taken all the books, which is either to sell or to put somewhere else. And every time it feels like being kicked in the teeth, and you think, what kind of special idiot am I to keep doing this? So democracy is not light and fluffy and doing any of these public projects, public art, public consultation, public anything. None of these things are without risk and disappointment. But the alternative is doing nothing, and I'm not okay with that. So I take a couple of days to dust myself off and have a quiet fume and curse everybody. Sometimes I've written the odd fierce note on the door of the library, but in general, what's interesting then is I've had an absolute outpouring of love and notes through the door, an extra surge of donations, and everyone like, don't give up on the library. And so there's always a silver lining to those really tough moments because it brings people out of the woodwork and say, oh no, we do want to vote for this. We don't want you to close the library. We're going to keep voting and supporting you and bringing more donations. I mean, people are sometimes running up within the hour that it's happened to restock with more books. And so, yeah, it can be a lonely place doing anything in a community because there are always going to be people who are takers more than givers. But I would say they are not the majority. My goodness, no. The majority is quite often quite quiet. But when the chips are down, they come through. And so maybe everyone should just be a little bit more brave and not wait for the chips to be down or the books to be taken or the, threat to be on their doorstep before they do the thing. The phrase that I come back to time and time again is do small things with great love. And a community book box, a little free library, is by definition small, but it's done with great love. And as long as it is done with great love, I think people respond to that more than, yeah, I think people respond to that.